An amazing day. All right. Had to redo this video. I had some mic issues, so hopefully it's corrected. I have the chat open. I may not fully be able to attend to the chat, but what I want to talk to a little bit about today is from system shifters to system stabilizers. All right. Doing a Black community focused sort of series here where we try to kind of microscopically look into some of the different conditions that impact the Black community and factors and variables. Right, there's many different dimensions, and we'll be here all night just sort of like pinpointing what issues are impacting the community today. But we made you famous, right? We made the right person famous. You hear a lot of this verbiage a lot around the audience and fan base sort of celebrating that they was able to make somebody famous, right? But being an African American and being famous is a lot different than being, a European, right, or a non-Black person and being famous, all right? So it says here, there's a strange thing that happens in America when a Black voice rises high enough to be heard. The world cheers when you're raw, right? On that ascension part of the African American's career, right? When they're raw and unfiltered and authentic, right? They're unpolished and they're hungry, right? But the moment you step into certain rooms, the applause changes. Suddenly, the truth that made you powerful becomes the truth you're expected to tame. This video is not about the rise of a celebrity. It's about the transformation that happens when a system realizes you are influential. When the audience shifts from the people who made you, right, to the people who now manage you. All right, tonight and this afternoon, we're going to uncover how system shifters become system stabilizers, not because they wanted you to change, but because the system needed them to. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about how, when they say we made you famous, we made the right person famous, audience, there's not enough attention that's placed on the audience, right? On the fan base, on the invisible strings that made this person famous. All right. I want to say over 50% of the audience, even on YouTube and different media platforms, is white, right? European. So when you're a Black person or African American person that's rising up, right? When you grow up, you're thinking you're going to be a justice fighter, right? You're going to protect your people. You're going to fight for your people. You're going to be the voice. You're going to be the change, right? And as you come up and you're speaking to the African American community, you're speaking to the audience. And then as you get on, right, and you get famous and you get that notoriety, then that voice changes, right? You went from being, I'm gonna be the justice fighter, I'm gonna be the one that fights all this oppression, I'm gonna be the one that changes everything, I'm gonna be the different Black famous person, right? And then you get on and you get deals, you get contracts, you get all these negotiations for 50 million, 100 million. Then you're like, I can't talk about justice and oppression, can't talk about all that. I got terms, I got contracts, right? All of a sudden the tone changes, all right, when you're not maintaining that status quo. So metaphorically, what is status quo, right? What is this comfort zone that the dominant society, this cushion that the dominant society sort of operates from? So it says here, the status quo is a kind of atmospheric pressure. It's an invisible climate that shapes how everyone breathes, moves, and speaks without noticing the weight on their own chests. It is the soft hum beneath a society's daily rhythm. The background music that plays so constantly that people stop hearing the melody but still dance to its tempo. It is not loud, violent, or dramatic. It simply is the established weather pattern of a culture. So familiar that anything colder or hotter feels like a threat to the ecosystem. It asks for calm skies, predictable winds, and a world where nothing storms too suddenly. In a metaphorical sense, the status quo becomes the comfort zone of the dominant world view, the place where the temperature feels normal, where the lighting stays warm and undisturbed, where no furniture ever gets rearranged. It is the room that asks everyone entering, lower your voice, soften your edges, and match the decor. When someone walks in carrying a truth that cracks the wallpaper or a rhythm that doesn't match the metronome, the walls lean in politely, not to argue, but to remind them where they are. The room does not forbid change, it simply makes stillness easier than movement. And so the status quo becomes a stage set, lit in a way that highlights some bodies and dims others. A place where the script rarely changes, even when new actors arrive. Anyone who steps onto this stage quickly learns that applause comes not from improvisation, but from preserving the tone the audience expects. The quiet agreement between performer and crowd is simple: maintain the mood, keep the peace, protect the lighting. And in this arrangement, the status quo becomes more than a system, it becomes a comfort, a cushion, a familiar warmth that whispers to everyone, do not disturb the room, right? So there is a status quo. There is this invisible force or this sort of like background music that plays when, African Americans want to get famous. And early on, they're not thinking about that, right? They're like, man, I'm going to get famous. I'm going to fight for my hood. I'm going to be the voice of the oppressed. I'm going to fight for justice. I'm going to get all this wealth, open up organizations and companies. I'm going to rewrite this narrative in the black community. I'm going to save these niggers, right? And then as soon as you get into these spaces where you got the $1 million contracts, $100 million contracts, $50 million contracts, and those terms get read, I can't speak on some of these issues. I can't speak on some of this, right? Because now your sort of focus is on the dominant society, all right? Over 50%, right, of the audience, even on YouTube, film industry, music, I want to say about 56% is white. And that's fine, right? This isn't an anti-white platform. However, right, not all white people in America have black coworkers, black friends, black neighbors, right? There isn't just this embedded connection, right, between races where they understand a lot of these justice movements as African Americans may understand it or perceive it, right? So let's look at some research and statistics on what is the right relationship to the black community if over half of your audience are white folks, right? How are they relating to black people, right? 75% of white Americans have no black friends in their close friendship network, right? The source is from Public Religion Research Institute and the American Values Survey. This means 3 out of 4 white Americans experience zero intimate proximity to black folks, making entertainment their primary exposure to blackness. 91% of white American social circles are entirely white, right? This is from the Public Religion Research Institute. They showed the average white American social network is 91% white, 1% black. This creates a vacuum where white consumers interpret black stories from a distance, not from relational experience. 77% of white Americans live in a majority white neighborhood. The U.S. Census and Brookings Institute analysis, right? Segregation remains one of the strongest barriers to interracial proximity, even in diverse states. Only 8% of white Americans say they interact socially with black people often, quote unquote. The Pew Research Center Racial Attitudes Survey. This means that daily informal contact, right, the grocery stores, gyms, bars, and gatherings is extremely limited between black and white folks. 43% of white workers have zero black coworkers in their workplace. This is from the General Social Survey, plus the Harvard Workplace Segregation in the U.S. study. This shows proximity is not just residential, it also affects workplace relationships and team diversity. Only 10% of white Americans have a black coworker that they would call a friend, all right? So, not a lot of interaction, right, between a lot of black and white people, where you do have some, but not much, right? What does that do psychologically to a black artist, maybe a black activist, right? A star, rising from the ghettos, right? Who, when they start off, everything is about the black community, saving the black community. We're going to rescue them from oppression. We're going to fight justice, all this, we're going to do the best that we can to help, save these Israelites, right? So, but what does that do psychologically when you rise to the top? Now your audience, right, majority of your audience is dominated by a community who can't connect, right, to some of these experiences. Not all, right? So it says here, in America, entertainment is not merely an industry. It is a gatekeeping mechanism disguised as applause. When over half of the audience viewership or consumer base is white, the marketplace quietly reshapes Black creativity into something palatable rather than prophetic. A Black entertainer might enter the industry fueled by authenticity, right? They're raw, right? You notice that when Black entertainers come up, they're so raw, they're so unapologetic, right? They're gonna shift the system, right? So it says a Black entertainer might enter the industry fueled by authenticity, social critique, and a desire to shift culture upward. But once confronted with the reality that the majority of their income is dependent on the approval of people who do not share their lived experiences, their message subtly bends. They lean or they learn the unspoken rules. Success in America is never just about talent, it's about soothing the comfort zones of the dominant group. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that it incentivizes Black public figures to dilute their own cultural truth in exchange for economic security. Research showing that 76% of white citizens have no Black friends, coworkers, or neighbors means the entertainment industry becomes the primary point of racial exposure for many white Americans. When white audiences lack lived proximity to Black life, they consume Black identity as a product rather than a reality. That creates an economy where the safest, least threatening, least politically disruptive version of Blackness becomes the most profitable. In such a system, a Black figure who speaks too sharply may not just lose fans, they lose multi-million-dollar contracts tethered to fragile white comfort. At the same time, the scarcity of Black political and economic power intensifies the pressure to conform because Black audiences make up a smaller percentage of buying power in certain entertainment sectors. Their influence is strategically minimized, right? There's a lot of Black people, the higher you go up, in a lot of these settings and in America in general. So why do I got to keep impressing you niggas? Why do I got to keep prioritizing you guys? There's not a whole lot of you guys, Check this mic. Why do I got to keep impressing you? Why do I got to keep putting you guys first? It's only about 5 of you guys. Now, in the beginning, you 5 were everything. It's like, man, it's about my 5. I got 5 people to show up. I got 5 Black folks. Yes, I'm doing great things. I'm on top. But as soon as you start to rise to a certain level of audience, you Black folks will be all right. You guys will be all right. So the numbers make a really big difference. So it says Black superstars are often too financially dependent on white majority consumption to fully honor the community that elevated them earlier in their careers. This dynamic explains why many rappers, comedians, actors, or cultural icons proudly embrace Black culture on their ascent only to distance themselves from Black consciousness once they cross over, quote unquote. It's not betrayal, it's survival under a system that punishes Black disruption and rewards Black compliance. The tragedy is that a figure positioned to be a system shifter often becomes a system stabilizer. The very audience demographics that create wealth for Black elites simultaneously strip them of the courage or freedom to challenge power. They become polished and palatable, right? Less Malcolm X, more marketable. Less truth telling, more brand protecting. And as their wealth grows, the psychological chains tighten. They learn that silence pays better than revolution. Neutrality is safer than truth, right? And that comfort, especially white comfort, is the real currency of American success, right? So 15 points. I'm not going to be able to go through all points, but I'm going to kind of highlight a few of them on how this impacts the Black sort of, performer, right? That system shifter, right? So it says when 50% more of your audience is white, your survival instincts subconsciously bend towards their approval. A Black entertainer learns quickly that their income is directly tied to how comfortable large white audiences feel consuming them. Even when the performer wants to push boundaries or speak boldly about injustice or politics, there is an internal calculus that forms. Will this offend the demographic that pays me the most? This becomes a spiritual tug of war where authenticity must negotiate with economics, right? And economics usually win. Brands, studios, and networks prefer figures who keep white audiences comfortable, right? They call it broad appeal, but functionally it means anti-disruptive blackness. We can't have you niggas showing out, right? If you're gonna come in and you're gonna come up, you better fucking behave, right? A black figure might feel racial frustration, grief, or righteous anger, but expressing it publicly risks alienating the demographic that controls revenue flow. Thus, the entertainer polishes away the rough edges, sharp truths, and revolutionary instincts because the system rewards conformity and it penalizes confrontation. Since many white Americans don't live around black communities, entertainers become their primary connection to blackness. This creates pressure for black entertainers to perform a sanitized version of identity that fits white imagination. Instead of being free to shift systems, they become trapped in the role of racial ambassadors, right? Required to soothe and entertain. And because their audience lacks cultural grounding, speaking too honestly can trigger discomfort that threatens the black entertainer's financial security, right? There is an unspoken expectation that black elites should be grateful, right? You should be grateful for your success because the majority of their earnings come from white consumers. This fosters a psychological obedience. Don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? This expectation shapes public behavior. It pressures black figures into silence or performative positivity rather than structural critique. Gratitude becomes weaponized, turning into a burden that prevents black public figures from challenging oppressive symptoms, right? Systems. So this is a really huge point, right? A lot of black folks they get on, they kind of start their way up through the ghetto and through the hood. They're doing them little local comedy clubs and local rap clubs, right? A lot of black folks, and then as they move up, they get to these dominant white spaces, right? And you got to be grateful. You should be thankful. We're paying for the tickets. We're paying for these shows. We're paying for these concerts. And you're over here talking about racial injustice and racism. How is there racism? You're famous, right? So when white consumers form the majority of an entertainer's base, one social misstep, controversial stance, or politically charged statement can collapse entire revenue streams. This creates a cultural or self censorship disguised as professionalism. Black entertainers become architects of their own suppression, reshaping their message to avoid backlash. The fear of financial collapse becomes stronger, right, than the desire for cultural liberation. So it says instead of boldly criticizing oppressive systems, many black elites adopt a middle ground persona that feels safe to white audiences. They begin to use vague inspirational language rather than pointed racial truth. Their content becomes apolitical, sanitized, and spiritually diluted, a performance of neutrality that secures the financial longevity at the cost of their cultural impact. System shifters become system polishers because relatability sells more than revolution. All right. Hope this reaches those who was meant to reach. There's a lot of wisdom here that I can't fully tap into right away, but I feel like those who need to understand it. And, you know, we made you famous. We made you famous. We made the right person famous. Sometimes being famous isn't always a good thing because it disconnects you from a lot of the passion, right? And the momentum a lot of you black folks have of trying to, stand up, right? And to be a voice for the oppressed, right? To kind of be system shifters, right? And to be that change, right? But sometimes it comes at a price, right? It's the value of gaining the whole world and losing your soul, right? Christ called it out. So hope you guys have a blessed day. I'm out.